welcome to ThePrint and to this webinar. This is an exclusive webinar for our members. It's 24th November, just 2 days short of this year's Constitution Day celebration, which is when on 26th November 1949, the Constitution was adopted by the Constituent Assembly. So at ThePrint, to mark the day, we thought of bringing you this webinar to discuss the constitutional vision from the framers of our Constitution to those responsible for implementing its ideals and upholding the vision on the ground ever since then in the past over 70 years. And I'm very happy and extremely excited to introduce you to our panel today. We have Aparna Chandra, Associate Professor of Law, National Law School of India, University, Bengaluru, and we have Senior Advocate Saurabh Kirpal and Senior Advocate Gopal Sankaranarayanan joining us today. Together, the three of them hold immense knowledge and understanding of our Constitution. They're here to answer any and all of your questions, any question that you may have. So big welcome to all three of you and thank you for being here. Now, just to set the stage for all our members, we already have quite a few questions here. As you can see, I have quite a few pages with me. And we also have a live chat going on for our members to send their questions, which Saurabh and Gopal have already started using. So I love the enthusiasm. Now, our members, just to let our panelists also know, they're a very curious and knowledgeable bunch of people. So I'm going to take as many of their questions as possible and put them over to you over the course of this webinar, which will be around 45 to 15 minutes. And we'll try to take as many questions as possible. So this will be a very interactive session with our members. We already have about 60 participants here. I also have my colleague Revati Karan helping me with these questions. Thank you so much, Revati. Now, to begin with, like I said, over 70 years ago, we had 299 people come together, work for almost 3 years, 2 years, 11 months, and 17 days to present to us the Constitution of India. Now, in one line, this for our panelists, consider this a rapid fire round. How would you describe the Constitution? I'm giving you 30 seconds, but in that much time, I'm telling all our members this right now that, you all can also send us a line in the chat box as to how would you describe the Constitution. I'll read up a few of them at the end of this webinar. So don't forget to send us your answers. Now, coming back to our panelists, over to you three. How would you describe the Constitution in one line?
I quickly jump before someone else says what I'm going to say.
Okay,
so,
sure.
Gopal will take his own time to understand, so he'll be the last, I assume.
Slow to process.
Yeah. No, for me, it's quite simple. The Constitution is a charter of hope. It is a promise that the people of India have made to themselves as to how we will make all our lives better. Simple as that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Aparna, Gopal, who would like to go next?
I'm happy to go next.
Okay.
Granville Austin called it the Charter for Social Revolution. I think we can update that and say it is a charter for political and social revolution. And at least that's the standard against which we can measure it. It may not have lived up to that potential, but that at least was part of the framing design. The political revolution from a colonial order to a post-colonial order, and a social revolution from a casteist feudal order to a egalitarian social order.
So we'll probably get back to that remark in a bit, Aparna, that it might have not lived up to its potential. Gopal, over to you.
Apurva, for me, I think the Constitution is virtually a part of the human spirit. As Indians, we need to understand that it's not just a book that lawyers use. So it's one of our most precious ideals. And the more we aspire to move forward together with what I believe is the most core ideal in the Constitution, which is fraternity, where we look out for each other, not only ourselves. Right. I think it binds us together. And for me, it is, and I've said this before, it's like Tolkien said, it's the ring that binds us all.
Mm-hmm.
It's above religion, it's above all sorts of division. And it keeps us together.
That's very well said. And that also takes me to the next question that one of our viewers had sent us. But before that, there's also a debate that, it's always contended that a few people say that the Constitution was a document in English created by elite consensus and has had little influence on India's greater population, is what a lot of people say. And our first question that's coming in is from Rajiv Puri, who's asking, is Constitution an idealism and politics a realism? Yes, Aparna.
If you look at the framing of the Constitution in those 2 years, 11 months, etc., and the years that preceded it, I think there was a lot of realism in the framing of the Constitution. We tend to idealize in some ways our founders, and we tend to idealize the founding generation, and there's good reason for that. But if you look at the framing of the Constitution, there was a lot of bargaining, there was a lot of negotiation, there was a lot of compromise. You have to remember that the people who were sitting in the Constituent Assembly were also the Provisional Parliament, and they were charged with the daily affairs of governance. And that bled into the discussions in the Constituent Assembly, where they're struggling with these challenges of governance, and they're trying to see how best can we evolve this charter for ourselves, which will account for the practical realities of governance. So I would think that to call the Constitution a idealist and not a realist, I think would be a mistake, because they're very, very grounded in the concerns that the Indian social and the political setup is likely to face in the future.
Right. Saurabh, Gopal, would you guys like to add?
I think that's absolutely correct, Aparna. I wouldn't like to disagree with the professor of constitutional law. I'm not going to come out any the better for it. But if you see the Constitution, it is very much a political document which realizes that governments of the day will exceed their powers. And it is a set of rules which is seeking to restrain those powers, right? So in its idealism, the idealism is, of course, that, yes, we want to achieve good, but it's a very practical document, realizing that we can achieve that good only by having a political a judicial control over the politics, right? So it's a system of controls also. So there is realism embedded in it. But another point would be, of course, the facet would be that a constitution has to be an aspirational document, right? Any preamble you read of any constitution around the world, it is a charter of what the country hopes to become. So to that extent, in terms of the way the constitution embodies a moral authority or a moral compass, it's idealistic. In directive principles of state policy are the ideals incorporated within the constitution. But to say that is no connection with politics is, I think, a bit unfair to our Constituent Assembly framers.
Right. Gopal.
I feel that when the constitution was made, even though it's an extremely lengthy constitution, the longest written constitution and things like that, I still believe it follows that age-old piece of advice that actors are given, that less is more. And I believe that it kept itself open-ended enough for several generations to interpret and reinterpret, to allow elbow room for greater rights to be read in, for new boundaries to be laid, and continues to be laid to the present day. I think in being prescient enough to see that, our founding fathers were actually very, very much rooted in reality, while, as Saurabh said, keeping those ideals in mind for the future. If I may just say, there's a movie called With Honors. It's about a kid in Harvard Law School, and there is a bum, as they call it, a homeless man who he makes friends with. So he comes in for these classes which are being held in the law school, and he sits with this young student who he's become friends with. And at some point, the professor, who thinks very highly of himself, teaching constitutional law, asks him, because he hears this so-called homeless man talking and thereby interrupting the class. He said, "Why don't you tell me what the ideal of the Constitution is?" And he says, the ideal of the Constitution is that these framers, who were white Anglo-Saxon farmers, had actually borne in mind the fact that on a future day, there is the possibility of change.
Right.
That different generations will come with different ideas. And he said, that's why this constitution is made even for bums like me. It actually captures what even this constitution does. It is made for bums like Saurabh and me as well, many generations after it was made.
This is a movie recommendation for all our members as well. Look at the variety of inputs coming in already. Since we just spoke about a time when the Constitution was made, I'd like to take up another question, which is by Srinivas Narasimha, who's asking how committed, Srinivas, my bad. He's asking how committed are our present political leaders to the idea of India as defined by our Constitution?
Well, I might well just jump in there. This is, of course, a question on politics of today rather than the Constitution per se.
Right.
To that, I will only say that every politician, of course, pays lip service to what the Constitution is and what they believe the Constitution is. And after all, they take an oath of office, pledging allegiance to the Constitution. But of course, there are politicians and politicians. I'm not one of those people who will paint everybody with the same brush and say all politicians are people who don't wish to abide by the Constitution. There are a very large number of people who do. It's a question often of what the interpretation of the Constitution is, which they disagree on. There are good faith disputes that happen between people about what the Constitution does. But I think the desire to change the Constitution and the desire to not be bound by the strict terms of the Constitution has been prevalent from 1950, pretty much. As everyone knows, the First Amendment to the Constitution happened by the very Constituent Assembly that made it. So they were the politicians who, after having given themselves the fundamental rights, went ahead and changed and took away some of those rights. Right. So and those were the ideals of the Constitution that they changed. So this friction between the political reality and the constraints of the Constitution is part of the natural political process. And to expect that will not happen either in India or anywhere else in the world, indeed, is, I think, a bit hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Gopal, Aparna, what do you guys like?
I feel that for the large part, and I'm with Saurabh on this. In my younger days, I used to paint all politicians with the same brush. I thought they were the bane of existence. I have watered that down to a certain extent, but I feel that present politicians, and I believe this is true across dispensations, across parties, all of that. But I feel that the present dispensation is in many ways at odds with what I believe the ideal of the Constitution should be. I would expect to see a little more selfless behavior. I would expect to see less talk of division. I would expect to see virtually no talk of imagined fears. And I see a lot of that happening. And I would definitely not expect for the national security argument to be trotted out every time there is a difficulty that the governments face in court, particularly if it is to oppose something as basic as civil liberties and bail, right? We have a whole bunch of trigger-happy social media commentators who are willing to accept what the media tells them about a crime being committed and therefore argue against human rights until the moment their own son or daughter is arrested for something. Suddenly, then human rights is brought to their mind. So I believe that on many of these things, governments, state and central, are much at odds with the ideals of our Constitution.
I would answer your question in two parts. On the day-to-day governance and the running of institutions, the Constitution surprisingly performs really well, and we don't see it. I think that's a sign that the Constitution is performing well. We do have, elections every 5 years. People respect them, somewhat respect the mandate. The processes that are set out in the Constitution, right? The structure of government, etc. Broadly, we work along those lines. And that is no mean feat. Right? It takes a lot for a constitution to move from being a paper to becoming practice. Yeah. And across the world, if you see the history from the mid-1950s, the 1950s, the decolonization movement, India has been very, very exceptional in that what has been written in the Constitution has become the basis for the organization of the state. Right? actually very, very unusual. So on a day-to-day basis, on just the working itself out of the structure of the state, the constitution is remarkably successful if you compare it to other experiments that have happened in post-colonial states, definitely. On the ideals that inform the constitution, I think I would absolutely agree with Gopal. I think some of the key ideals that the constitution framers had, they put into the preamble, right? And the preamble, of course, as you know, was the objectives resolution. The first thing that the framers framed was what they call the objectives resolution. This is what the constitutional project is about. These are the principles that we will keep in mind in framing the constitution. And subsequently, they revised that a little bit and converted that into the preamble. And if you read that preamble, that's talking about justice, that's talking social, political, economic justice, it's talking about liberty, it's talking about dignity, it's talking about fraternity. And I'm not sure that those are the values that are necessarily informing politics today. The politics of today, particularly of the ruling dispensation at the center, is not a politics of plurality. It's not a politics of diversity and respect for fraternity. At least that's my take on how the politics measures up to the constitution.
Right. I'm sure that answers your question, Narasimha. From what Saurabh said about the desire for change, we have a question related to that where Vishwanathan KL is asking. It's a longer question. Please stay with me. He's saying, in a world where nothing is permanent and the Indian Constitution having been subjected to more than 100 amendments in 75 years being a written document, is there a need to revisit the whole document? Now, he's suggesting that it may be a good idea to remove the legislative portion and convert them into laws and retain only the spirit and essence of our constitution. This may actually make it easier for the legislature, judiciary, and the executive to function, and for we the people, and he's put it in quotes, we the people to follow. And just to let you guys know, we have at least 2-3 more questions where I think people are asking how they can understand the constitution better, because I think this is the entire debate about the plain language movement, because legal language is not always very accessible to the general public. So I think that's where his question's coming from too. He's added a disclaimer, so I would add that to you guys. He's saying, I respect our constitution and was actually sworn into its safekeeping more than half a century back. So would any of you like to take that one?
I just wanted to jump in and say, I think it's very, very unfortunate that if you go around this country and walk into a bookshop, you'd hardly ever find a copy of the Constitution.
Right.
We have a serious lack of access to the constitutional text. Particularly in vernacular languages. You'll get it in English, maybe in some urban centers, but you'll almost never get it anywhere. Okay. In this day and age, I think you could find it online, but that's not really an answer or a response. What we need is for our citizenry to understand the importance of the Constitution in their lives, how it actually touches them. That really starts with reading the Constitution. The language of the Constitution, in my view, is not very complicated. It's fairly straightforward. It's we lawyers and judges who have complicated it. The Constitution's values and its principles are broadly straightforward. You can read it, and to a large extent, it is what it is. But what I don't think, and it's very difficult for us, very honestly, to explain to citizens who are laymen and not lawyers, that our constitution as it stands today is not just the bare text. It is its interpretation by courts, right? And that interpretation is actually in many, many different directions. The central aspect that gets talked about all the time is fundamental rights. But like over the last few days, including today, we've been talking about the Election Commission and its independence. That's a whole different dispute and an issue which is much beyond it. Right. And there are many other parts. Every time there's a governor who is appointed, or if there is some supersession of a judge, or if a defection takes place, or a speaker has to take a decision, all of that comes from the Constitution. Many of these are answered just by reading the text. Many of these. Some parts of it requires a lawyer's nuance to try and explain what is in it. I'd be very honestly telling you, I think 95% of our lawyers themselves, me included on many occasions, are not capable of fully encapsulating, understanding, and explaining the Constitution as it stands today. So it's as complex a document with its interpretations for many people to understand, but that shouldn't stop us from embarking on educating ourselves on what it is. I think it'll be interesting if you find out from your members how many of them actually own a Constitution copy.
Since Gopal has put this question up, members, you could raise your hands and we'll keep account of the people who own a copy of the Constitution.
Speaking of a copy of the Constitution, my copy of the Constitution is a pocket handbook. And it says on the fly page, Constitution of India by Gopal Sankaranarayanan. Because there's a foreword to that Constitution written by Gopal. So the entire Constitution has been attributed to him. So congratulations, Gopal.
Thank you.
On amendments, I actually don't see that as a problem. Right. In fact, I think it would be a bigger problem if the Constitution was difficult to amend, because then you would land up in a situation where, you would have one of two things. Either the Constitution outlives its utility and then you overthrow the Constitution with all sorts of instability that brings, or it just becomes unworkable, right? And there are other constitutions, particularly in the US, which is very, very hard to amend, where you're seeing some of these problems. And as a result, what also happens is that it pushes power into the hands of judges, because the only way to change constitution is through new interpretations of the Constitution. So I think actually that we have, with some backstop mechanism, such as the basic structure doctrine that we have, we have a fairly decent amendment procedure. We could, obviously fine tune it a bit more, but I don't think it's particularly problematic. But just on, public access to the Constitution, it's very interesting that when the Constitution was being framed, the debates in the Constituent Assembly used to be carried in the newspapers every day. And people used to petition the Constituent Assembly all the time. We heard this debate, it was on the radio, it was in the newspaper, and there was a whole public literacy campaign that was taken up alongside it. And then they'd write back to the Constituent Assembly with their feedback, etc. And I don't know to what extent it influenced the framers, but you see aspects of it during the framing where some member would rise and say that, the newspapers are reporting that people are upset about X provision, Y provision, and we should rethink it, etc. And there's some very fascinating research that's coming out in the next year or so about public participation in India's constitution framing. This relates back to a point that you made earlier about elitism and framing. I don't think that's the entire story. Right. Just as a contrast with what Gopal was saying is the reality today, I think at the moment of framing, there was greater engagement.
And I join Aparna with acknowledging the fact that I too am a recipient of Gopal's pocket Constitution, which I don't always carry with me because it'll remind me of Gopal all the time. And I'm not sure that's a good idea, but it's like some
out at this point. I think I need to get it.
Yeah, we're all Gopal's fanboys and girls. That's been judicially determined as well. But coming to the language of the Constitution, look, it is a document which we all want to be a living document, right? It's something that's done in 1950. If it's going to have meaning and purpose beyond 1950 for the next 100 or X number of years, it has to use language which is as broad and generic as possible, right? And that's how the Constitution is framed, the right to life article, the equality article. And that's what concerns citizens most. While it's correct that there is a lot more to the Constitution, the fundamental rights, the most direct impact that any part of the Constitution has on the lives of an individual is a fundamental rights chapter. And that is written in very, very broad language. Now, of course, the moment it is written in broad language, you can understand it, right? Because it is simple English. But as Gopal said, that you can't understand that simple language because there's so much judge-made law about that. And the reason for that is that being a living document, being something that has to cater to constantly changing society, it's inevitable that the interpretation that is given to the Constitution will constantly change. That's inevitable. So even if the language is simple, it's over time going to become complicated. The way the Income Tax Act once when it was promulgated was simple, and with the amendments and the interpretation, it becomes complicated. So there is a problem really in just giving the Constitution, even the vernacular, to the population. There needs to be greater legal education. You see, I think sometimes we pick at low-hanging fruit and say, let's give everybody a Constitution and they'll know what their rights are. No, actually, it doesn't help someone to know what Article 21 and 22 of the Constitution is. They need to be given documents which show that if you are arrested by the police, this is your right? Those rights flow from the Constitution, from Article 22. But if you read the bare words of Article 22, that has no practical impact on your life and no understanding of what it is. And you are not taking the constitutional desire forward. You have, therefore, to give people the tools of understanding the laws in the vernacular. So I would say, rather than the Constitution per se being given, there should be books which are written, and especially on criminal law. I think that is one area that goes completely non-understood by the vast majority of our country as to what the basic rights are. When you're stopped by a policeman on the road or something happens. So that would be a better way of making people aware of what the Constitution truly is than just the bare text of the Constitution.
Right.
And as regards the question about whether there should be a review, most certainly not. At least that's my it comes from two reasons. One, the Constitution, as Aparna said, is working, right? So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the second is that if it's going to be fixed in the current dispensation, there is no guarantee, and in fact, all indications that the document we end up with will be far worse than what we have just now.
Right. Saurabh, since you mentioned and touched upon the Constitution being a living document, we have a question coming in specially for you. Sandeep Dutt is saying, he's firstly saying thank you for enabling the chat, just letting all our members know that the chat is completely open. You can send us your questions. We're keeping track of it and trying to pick as many as possible. Sandeep says, I have only one question for respected Saurabh Kirpal. How do we ensure that the Constitution is a living document and not a framed one?
Well, the fact is it is a framed constitution that no one can get away from. But there is no necessary contradiction in also being a living document. It's the debate between a living constitution and a framed constitution seems, I think, often to arise more in the US context, where there's original intention and the idea that what they decided, the rights that were given at each of those amendments were frozen at that point of time. I think there is general consensus in India today, judicially and otherwise, that the Constitution is a living document, right? So there is nothing we need to do to make sure that it is a living document other than to ensure that the status quo continues. No judge today perceives her or himself bound by the original intention of the Constitution and saying it's frozen. And there, I think, the increasing tendency actually, and I noticed that in the judgments which are coming now, to refer to the Constituent Assembly debates to be slightly worrisome. That was meant really as an exception. And the moment you refer to the Constituent Assembly debates is when you are harking back to the original intention, right? And that is what makes a constitution a framed document. So I think we should try to avoid getting too much into the discussion of the Constituent Assembly debates. And we should try to understand how the law has flowed through the interpretations given to the Constitution by various judgments. And that's happening.
Right. Just letting our members know, I have a lot of questions here and I'm looking at my phone because I'm getting questions there in case you think that I'm, getting distracted by my phone. Just a disclaimer there. But moving on to the next question. Now, earlier in the discussion, I remember Gopal mentioned trigger happy people on the media. We have a question from G. Rajaram, who's just asking, is tinkering with laws for populism leading to worsening of delivery of justice?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that? Tinkering with laws?
Tinkering with laws for populism, leading to worsening of delivery of justice.
Well, I think that would always lead to worsening of law if you're catering to it only for a populist purpose. But the important question is, if the purpose is not only populism, but it's also furthering rights in the Constitution, ideals that we have in the directive principles, things like that. I think it's definitely good. Uniform Civil Code is a prime example, right? It is a promise made in the Constitution, in the directive principles. It may also be a populist measure, particularly with a government that has made a promise and come into power on that. And I don't see why they shouldn't go forward and implement it.
Right. Aparna, Saurabh.
I will disagree a bit on that. But first, to your question more directly on populism, I mean, there are two ways you can understand populism, right? One is just short-term instrumental benefits that you're looking for. That will obviously lead to a worsening of any kind of principle-based order, right? So if the idea is that you put aside the principles of the Constitution for short-term gains, and that's going to lead to an issue of the worsening of the conditions of justice that we have in the country. But populism can also mean that you take initiatives that are popular but also consistent with the Constitution, and that's fine. On the Uniform Civil Code, I mean, one thing, and this goes back to something that Saurabh was saying, that we made some choices in our Constitution at the time of the framing of the Constitution, and we have to see how best that works in our current political reality, right? And we have to work with those constraints, and we have to see how best they work in our current constitutional reality. I don't think we should be open to be critical of the choices that were made in 1950 as well. I think that's crucial to being an engaged citizen under the Constitution. On the Uniform Civil Code, if the concern is about gender justice, for example, you don't need uniformity for that. You need equality for that. You don't need uniformity for that. I think one thing that we end up doing with the Uniform Civil Code and with the discussion around the Uniform Civil Code is we conflate equality and uniformity. And I do think that if we keep those two things separate, there is need for reform of personal laws. That's definitely there. But I don't know that necessarily needs uniformity. And particularly, I'd be very, very concerned about, again, the present dispensation, whose vision of the constitutional order is not a pluralist constitutional order, to be engaging in that exercise of imposing uniformity on what is a very diverse reality.
Saurabh, would you like to come in and tilt the balance on either side of the argument?
Well, I can tilt it by maybe taking it into a completely different direction, because
I'd love that. Let's do this.
The question is that does tinkering for a populist reason harm the justice delivery system? Well, the problem, I think, often is more than tinkering with the law for a populist concern is that the only thing that happens is the tinkering of the law, rather than the actual hard work that is often required to bring about societal change. And I think that possibly may be a bridge between what Aparna and Gopal are saying. So, but I'll give, before I come to the Uniform Civil Code, say a simple thing like for a populist reasons, after the horrific gang rape of the woman in 2013, there was a populist uprising. The laws were tinkered, amended, and a vast amount of change was brought about. But it seems as though it was felt that is the end of it. And thus far and no further, and somehow amending the law by itself will give you the results. So I think that is a very dangerous problem. And that is what causes a harm in justice delivery system, because then you give up on all the other tools that you need in a society to bring about a social revolution, as was promised, as Aparna initially said in the preamble. But coming back on the Uniform Civil Code, I, for one, also remember the Constitution says that there should be a policy of prohibition. There should be many other things, which I don't know whether Gopal will necessarily agree with. But having said that, and is while it may be a reason to doubt the bona fides of a party in power as to bringing in a Uniform Civil Code, it's not to say that we should not try to move towards one, right? And the way may be, rather than having a sledgehammer approach in having a Uniform Civil Code in one go, to amend individual and make an attempt to individually start reforming each of the religious codes to bring them in line with the current conception and standards of gender equality. because that is the primary problem in most religious codes, is gender equality. So we start bringing the reform to it. There may come a point of time that there is a sufficient confluence and a agreement between various people as to what the civil code means. And so that at that point, when we move forward sufficiently legislatively, to then abandon the individual civil codes and have a uniform civil code. But it need not be an all or nothing approach, right? The idea should be, undoubtedly, because the Constitution says a uniform civil code, move towards it. But the way to move towards is, I think, not in just in one go. If it was so simple, it would have been done in 1950. Right? It was not done. It was kept in our constitution as something to happen in the future. And this is it's a task in progress. So let's see it as that and bring about change. But to say that I'm going to abandon the ideal of a uniform civil code is also possibly not a correct thing.
So
can I just come in? I just wanted to make a couple of comments. See, I feel too often the way debates are framed on issues are entirely in binaries. It is this or that. So for too long, for example, our debate on uniform civil code is framed only in one perspective. You have a Hindu code which has come in the 50s. You have nothing for other religions. So it's become a religious issue. Please understand that it's a uniform civil code. It doesn't use the word religion anywhere. You allow some politicians to frame that debate and then you react to it without understanding the various nuances and layers in this. Sexuality, for example, for me is a very important aspect of uniform civil code. For me, I understand uniform civil code simply as this. Every single human being in India needs to have the same civil rights available to them, whether it's in marriage, in guardianship, in divorce, in custody. In all these aspects, you need to have uniformity. You will not discriminate on the basis of gender. You will not discriminate on the basis of caste. You will not discriminate on the basis of religion. I believe that's a human goal and we should move towards that. But I agree, in practicality, maybe you have to move incrementally towards it. This is not a Hindu-Muslim framed debate. And while the present dispensation may like to frame it as that, that is not the way we constitutional lawyers approach it. That's one. The second, apropos what Saurabh said, both of us enjoy our drink, and many of them, in fact. I would say that, again, prohibition. It's not prohibition of alcohol in the Constitution. I've looked at it very carefully because it personally affects me. It's prohibition of intoxicating drinks and intoxicating drugs. A bottle of wine or a bottle of whiskey sitting there on its own is not an intoxicating drink, in my view. If you have 20 of those, then yes. If you have one drink and you step out, in my view, that's not an intoxicating drink. Prohibition doesn't apply there. Gandhi may have had his own ideas for saying this, but we have traveled long enough to know the difference between what is a narcotic and maybe a prohibition direction there. Even there, that is nuanced about the effects it has as against cannabis versus or marijuana versus others. And we've seen where that debate has gone, and it'd be a great thing to debate.
Okay, I'd like to bring
Apurva, can I say just something in addition to what Gopal said on the Uniform Civil Code, not on prohibition, in which I will defer to his greater knowledge. On the Uniform Civil Code, I think I completely agree with what Gopal was saying about the need for incrementalism. And it's very interesting to note on the point of Uniform Civil Code, 99% of our civil laws are uniform. Right. So contract law, tort law, etc., our civil procedure code, that's all uniform. So there is a small bit which deals with, the world of family laws that is not uniform and which is based more or less on one's religious, background. The second thing is that this is something that was discussed during the Constituent Assembly and up to the 80s used to find a lot of favor, even with people who today are opposed to the Uniform Civil Code, is to have other mechanisms, right? So again, in terms of incrementalism, to have opt-in codes or opt-out codes, right? Optional codes that one could opt in or opt out. That could be model codes that subsequently you get, enough of a consensus around. So it doesn't have to be one or the other of status quo or move completely to the Uniform Civil Code.
Right. With that discussion, I feel like we're moving towards the discussion on, and we've addressed this before, but just to nudge our panelists a bit on how citizens actually interact with the Constitution. Now, could you tell us a bit briefly about how ordinary Indians understand the Constitution, leverage it, and use it as a tool to expand their rights, and in a way shape the constitutional vision through their interaction with it? Because I feel like that's an important conversation. And I also have questions coming in. Guru Raj Narayan is asking, how about making the Constitution a part of the curriculum? We have very interesting ideas coming in. We have Aditya Chandra saying, why can't there be a module which is in form of FAQ forms that talks about the act and how it can be implemented in case of a bare act, to make it more accessible? But this is about how citizens have actually interacted with the Constitution to sort of frame its vision entirely. So if you could briefly tell our members about it.
Well, I might well go first. As I think all of us agree that a lot of the Constitution is judge-made law, right?
Right.
First thing that needs to happen to make things accessible to the common person is to ensure that the judgments that are written are comprehensible. With the greatest respect to even some of the most erudite judges who sit on the court today, their judgments are not accessible to the common person. They must be aware for whom they are writing. I think a common citizen of the US or the UK can pick up a judgment of the Supreme Court there, read it, and have a fair chance of understanding what is it that is being discussed. I, as a senior counsel, and I don't know about Gopal, but you see, jury's out. Even he will have but I must put it out here that Gopal and I are very, very dear friends and old friends. I'm a friend and he's old. So just coming back to these judgments need to be made accessible to people, because for instance, you would read the privacy judgment. There are 7 judgments which are written, which are 1,000 pages long. No one is going to have the patience to understand and read them. B, if you try to read them, it's impossible to understand what they are, partly because they're so long and verbose. Whatever they say, you're writing 200 pages, you're bound to contradict yourself somewhere or the other, because you're always trying to put caveats, because no judge wants to write something in absolute, because they'll be then hemmed in later. So they always put in little caveats, exceptions, and those caveats and exceptions sometimes go and swallow up the right, as we have seen. So there is a problem in judicial writing also that needs to happen. And how does the common person approach the Constitution? Well, in my personal case, I think by approaching the constitutional courts. When you think there is a perceived disadvantage that you face, or a real disadvantage that you face, you must stand up as a citizen for your rights, be it going to court, be it using your rights of protest as a civil society, standing up for your rights, and most importantly, speaking up. Your interaction with the Constitution and upholding the rights you think are valuable to you will begin with you. You are the one who has to protect it. And you can't even deign yourself to go out and say something because you're worried about what someone may do, someone may file something. Well, then you are not fulfilling your responsibilities as a citizen. At the least of which I expect is exercise that right to free speech, challenge it. And I think you will be surprised as a person when you make your right to have your free speech, how much right you actually have. The chilling effect is more dangerous than the actual government going out after you.
If I may come in here, I think the Constitution frames the conditions under which we live in society, right? So if we were living under a very different Constitution, the conditions in which we live in society, how we interact with each other, how the state interacts with us would be very different. So very often the working of the Constitution is something that it's around us, but we don't see it because it just shapes the conditions in which we live in society. Right? To what extent, for example, just to give an example, to what extent is it an aspect of our Constitution and the sort of the economic model that the Constitution enables that all of us are sitting here together and having this conversation and being able to say the kind of things that we are being able to say, that also has to do with fundamental rights. And it's not something that we're consciously thinking about that, because our Constitution is the way it is, therefore I can make a comment of the sort that I am making, right? So a lot of our conditions are being shaped by the constitution that we don't even realize. In terms of how citizens engage with the constitution more directly, I think again it shapes our understanding of what is just, what is unjust, what are the kinds of claims we can make upon the state, what is the expectation that we can have from the state. So our sense of something wrong has happened, something unjust has happened, and the state must answer, and we will go and protest if the state doesn't answer, is also often shaped. No, it's not completely shaped. It is very often shaped by what our understanding is of what our rights are and what our entitlements are under the Constitution. So that's why we speak in the name of the Constitution, right? We hold up the preamble and say, oh, this is the preamble that gives us, this is the Constitution that gives us these rights, and the government is not providing us the rights that we have. Or a policeman picks you up, arrests someone or tortures someone, and people go and get out the police station. They're claiming that an injustice has happened for certain reasons. Now, that might not be a perfect transference between or perfect overlap between what the Constitution says and what people's understanding of what the Constitution says is. But definitely our sense of what is right, what is wrong is shaped in part by the Constitution. And when we get a sense that the Constitution doesn't capture what our sense of justice and justice is, that is where the demand for constitutional change, I think, happens. This is not to say that whatever people feel is, just and unjust should be what the Constitution says it is. But just to say that it shapes very much, even if it's not directly, I don't know the Constitution end to end, it definitely shapes the conditions in which we operate and our sense of justice and injustice.
Right.
I'll keep my comments short. I feel that there is a lot of misinformation about laws, about what courts do, about what gets argued, and it's most often going out nowadays in 40 characters or less. It goes out in Instagram pictures. It goes out even in newspaper reports by trying to telegraphically capture what, in my view, cannot be captured. You just look for the headline and then you throw that out, and then there are people reacting to it. It's much more nuanced than that. And maybe now they've put lots of arguments on YouTube so you can see it and get to see the entirety of an argument to see exactly what goes on. So I feel a lot of the public's understanding of what law is misinformed. But you must repair that. It must be addressed. You know the old principle that ignorance of law is no excuse. Now, how is it not an excuse unless the onus is there to ensure that there is instruction in law to every human being? In our schools, we need to start teaching law as a compulsory subject. It needs to be a subject because we need empowerment and knowledge about our rights starting at the very root. A civics subject which is randomly taught to you to tell you what institutions there are 3 wings of government, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about law. I'm talking about stuff that will really apply to you when you're pulled over for jumping a light, if you have behaved in an abusive manner, things like that. You need to understand the pyramidical structure where there's a basic structure at the bottom, there's a constitution above it, the very many laws which come from it, what those important laws are, how they personally affect you. Until you get to that stage and you have your citizen instructed on it, the citizen has no clue how he can use the law as a weapon. Until then, it's some kind of foggy thing that lawyers talk about on TV.
I'll take the last 2 questions after this, and just to let our members know, these were some really actionable pointers by all 3 of our panelists. So a big thank you to all of them. Members, we'll be taking 2 more questions, but till then, just to remind you, let us know in the chat box how you would describe the Constitution, and I'll pick 2 or 3 of those descriptions at the end from all of you, just to put it out there. Now, another question that we have is coming from V. Ranganathan, who's asking each of you, he's saying from each of the panelists, what one aspect do you feel is misplaced or missing in the present document? They're really making.
I answered that in the chat. Civil rights. When Justice Antonin Scalia of the US Supreme Court, when he was alive, he came to India about 15 years ago. He had a conversation with one of our Chief Justices who was very proud of talking about the fact that it's a powerful constitution, it's a powerful Supreme Court and things like that. But Scalia made a very good point. He said, we have a Civil Rights Act. Of course, we overlook the fact that you needed a 1 million man march to get the Civil Rights Act in place in the US, but that you don't have it in India. Now, for those who don't really know what a Civil Rights Act is, it's this, that these fundamental rights you have in your constitution is mainly, if we don't get into the nuance and argue about it, is mainly against the state, public functions. It's mainly against that. There's some stuff which is like untouchability and others, which regulate interpersonal relations. But it's not available against private employers, for example. So if an employer doesn't want to employ me in a private company in Gurgaon because of my caste or because of my color or because of my gender or my sexual preference, there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. And that's a yawning gap for me, because the more we want to move towards, like I said, the goal of fraternity, you need to have everybody having values which are of working together as a fraternity.
Right.
And more often than not in India, you know that it's not going to happen voluntarily. You need to make it something that is enforceable. So I think for me, civil rights, that's actually a yawning gap.
Okay.
So let me come in here. I was actually going to say civil rights myself, but since Gopal's already touched on that, I think we could have more robust mechanisms of accountability. So under our constitution, for a citizen to hold the government accountable, there are two mechanisms. You vote or you go to court. That's broadly the two mechanisms that the constitution has. And from the vantage point of today, that's not enough. During between two election cycles, there have to be mechanisms to hold the government accountable through requirements of, say, transparency from the government at a constitutional level, of notice and comment and consultation and participation. So move away from representative democracy to participatory democracy, and that might require us to rethink many of our institutional structures that we've put in place, that we've taken by and large with some modifications from the 1935 Government of India Act. So I think introducing accountability as a central feature of the structures of government would be incredibly important.
Okay, so we have civil rights, we have accountability. Now, Saurabh.
Well, I'll have to quickly think of something else, since the obvious point was taken by, but there's one, I think, glaring gap in our constitution, and that relates to criminal law. I don't think our constitution paid sufficient attention as was required to protecting the rights of the individual citizen. So, for instance, we do not have in our constitution a clear presumption of innocence as being a constitutional right, right? The exact reflection of which has been in this PMLA judgment that has just come, upholding the fact. And that has a very dramatic effect. So the second is that the rights on arrest, etc., that you have, there is no clear clarity about these extra police authorities, these agencies, the ED. So the point is, anyone exercising police power must have, from the inception of the investigation, a control of the judiciary, right? This control of the judiciary is absent in our constitution in matters other than that very narrow constitutional provision in Article 21 and 22. So I think that is a yawning gap which has been exploited increasingly by our powers that be in framing more and more draconian legislation with less and less of judicial supervision. And another thing consequently to that, I suppose, would be, I feel, is that our constitution did not, at the inception, and still is not a satisfactory form of the entrenched provisions, that which cannot be amended. Right? So a large amount of our constitution has been decimated. Article 19 has been substantially affected, and right to property has been taken away. More importantly, through the introduction of Articles 31A, B, and C, the remaining fundamental rights also in certain instances have been weakened. And yes, we do have the basic structure doctrine on which certain laws have been struck down, very, very few. But that was also a judgment, be prospective in nature. So the damage that was done prior to that is sustained. So it's a grievous wound on our constitution, which is still bleeding those rights. So I think these are the few areas, I think, where the constitution could have done more, but didn't.
Okay, Mr. V. Ranganathan, you asked for 3 such answers. You got 4 of them. So I hope this answers your question. I'll just take one more question. It's coming from Neeraj Pant. He's asking, as brought out by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and he's quoting him, "A good constitution in bad hands won't be effective and vice versa. Unquote. Now he's asking, have the words of Dr. Ambedkar come true? Where and how the apex court it was not able to keep executive, legislature, and even media on track?
Well, I think that sad saga began pretty soon after the promulgation of the Constitution. While I'd say the early couple of decades of our Constitution was the judges were, I would say, fiercely independent. That's true. The slip started pretty much from there, and I think the obvious first instance is ADM Jabalpur, right? Any constitutional court that can uphold the emergency and the extent of deprivation of powers. And I don't think the situation has improved much since then. There has been an atonement by the creation of the PIL by those judges who felt that they could somehow wash the sins of the ADM Jabalpur and habeas corpus decisions. But unfortunately, that's no free pass that anyone can give to them. So it's rather sad that it is true that the Constitution can only function depending on the hands of who it rests, and those hands are increasingly shaky. Sorry.
I again agree with that assessment. I would think that the first fundamental rights case that went up before the Supreme Court, which was A.K. Gopalan's case, I think was itself an example of a downward slide, where what essentially, the court again, I think failed in its role at that moment to be an institution of accountability for holding Parliament and the executive to account. And over the years, in different domains, be it criminal law, be it preventive detention, be it institute powers of the governor, powers of the president, powers of the prime minister, what have you. One concern that you see across the board is it has failed to hold the executive to account, in ways that has allowed for what some scholars have called executive aggrandizement, and that's a condition in which the executive has outsized powers, which is not controlled very well either by the legislature or the judiciary, and that's something that one is witnessing across the world in a turn towards autocratization. So I think that's a larger concern with what's happened. But I think it's also when Ambedkar is talking about people who are working the Constitution, I think we should also think about the people themselves, right? How as a people have we lived up to the Constitution? Not just have our politicians and our institutions lived up to the Constitution, but do we demand accountability in terms of the Constitution from our politicians and from our institutions? So I think it's also in our hands. That's the question. Have we been good constitutional actors?
I think the judiciary has never stopped surprising us with the number of ways in which it can fail us. I think right from the outset, I have a different view on Gopal, and I believe some parts of Gopalan's judgment still survives for interpretation. But I believe when the first amendment to the Constitution was made, one of the celebrated prime ministers decided to protect his turf by making 3 critical amendments to our fundamental rights chapter through the First Amendment. When it was challenged, it was one of the strange amendments to the Constitution which came up and challenged in 3 different cases. In all 3 cases, they rejected the challenge. Taking laws which are made and putting them in what is known as the 9th schedule to the Constitution, so it's barred from challenge on any fundamental right, including 1419. I thought that was retrograde, and that should have been squashed right at the outset. I'm always proud of the fact that the Supreme Court, in its very first year, remember, Jivish, coming out of a very difficult kind of colonial regime, that the Supreme Court should have been bold enough to strike down laws which are made by Parliament in its very first year that talked about its independence. So it did both things. It went one way on some stuff, it went the other way where it shouldn't have. But much like all institutions, it's tried to correct itself, maybe not even in the same decade. but many years later, it's tried to correct itself. Even in recent years, I think because of the amount of media and particularly social media, you find a lot of criticism now coming about the manner in which cases are taken up and the manner in which cases are dealt with. About Shah Rukh Khan's son, for example, there were many views one way and the other. We find Stan Swami's case, I thought that it was tragic that there's a man asking for a straw and we're actually having to move court for something like that. It's shocking. But one very central thing I would think we should all follow, following up on what Aparna said, we believe that the meting out of justice is the job of the courts. That's only partly true. Right. Justice is to be meted out not only by institutions, but also by individuals. All of us on a daily basis are met with situations where we are in positions where we can curb injustice ourselves. But we mete out injustice, we tolerate injustice from others, and eventually, at much sharper focus, we take it to court and expect courts to adjudicate. I think we need to turn the mirror on ourselves, and every time you sit and criticize the courts and the judiciary, and we need to turn around and say, what did you do in such a situation? I think we all need to understand that justice is a value that all of us, while we enjoy it when we go to court, we must also dispense it, because we expect that from our greatest institutions.
And that's where the citizens' interaction with the Constitution comes in. And I'm so glad we had this webinar. With this, we've reached the end of this webinar. I'd like to believe that this was another way of us ensuring that citizens are interacting with the Constitution and taking it in a way to them, bridging that gap. Before I close the webinar, I'd like to take two of the answers that we got to my first question. We have Sandeep Dutt, who's saying that Constitution is simply a way to explaining the rights and duties for every citizen. It's not about institutions, but more about how we as individuals should expect and what we need to do to make a values-based society. I think that also resonates with what Gopal just said. And then we have Manish Gundev, who's saying that the Constitution is like getting justice in whatever form. Sometimes voice could be heard late, but justice could be done. So there's a ray of hope definitely there that we're leaving our members with. With this, we've reached the end of our discussion. Thanking all our panelists for being here. I think it was wonderful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure it was really helpful for our members as well. As for our members, always a big thank you and lots of love to all of you guys for being here, for supporting us the way you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for handling this so well, Apurva. I thought Saurabh would be an extremely difficult customer to deal with, but you've controlled him well, which very few people can say. Thank you.
I'll say nothing more. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.